The British Empire. What was the British Empire? An empire is a group of countries or states under the control of a single ruler. The British Empire began when the Tudors started acquiring lands abroad for Britain in the 16th century. By the early 18th century, Britain controlled lands in Canada, the east coast of America, and Central America, from which they could take furs, dried fish, tobacco, cotton, and new foods such as potatoes and other fruits. The map here shows the extent of the British Empire in 1715. During the next century, Britain gained control of more and more colonies across the world. These lands helped revolutionize industry by providing the raw materials that were needed and new markets for selling Britain's manufactured goods. The map here shows the extent of the British Empire in 1815. The empire helped to protect and promote trade, but in the last quarter of the 19th century, the empire developed rapidly as Britain sought to increase its power in the world. This was known as imperialism. The other European countries were also trying to build empires, and in Africa, the rush to acquire new lands became known as the Scramble for Africa. Britons Abroad. As you might imagine, this growing empire gave opportunities for Britons wanting to work abroad. Emigration. By 1900, the British Empire extended to more than 13 million square miles of land, containing 370 million people. With the rising population in Britain, many people emigrated, in other words, went abroad, to find work or a better standard of living. For labourers, the long, unpleasant sea journey was often worth putting up with for the chance of starting in a new life. Here we see an extract from a letter sent home from abroad. Dear Father and Mother, I like the country here very much. I got work the first day I was here, and I've had plenty of work ever since. Farmers and labourers all sit at one table here. I know that a poor man can do a great deal better here than he can at home. He is sure to get plenty of work if he is steady and can live cheaper. We work here from sunrise to sunset, but we do not work as hard as we do at home. This is from a letter from Canada sent by a man who emigrated there to his parents back in England, and published in a book called Letters from Sussex Immigrants, compiled by the Reverend Socket in 1832. How was this new empire controlled? The British government sent officials to control each colony as representatives of Queen Victoria. These officials usually had a high standard of living with many luxuries that they would not have had at home. Others who left Britain for the colonies went to civilize the native peoples. The Victorians thought of these people as little more than animals. They lived in mud huts with barely any clothes or possessions and spoke unintelligible languages. Missionaries were people who went out to convert the native peoples to Christianity. The British settlers thought themselves superior to the coloured native peoples, and this affected the way they treated them. When the Europeans arrived, the natives often welcomed them, having no reason to distrust them. Yet, if necessary, guns were used to get what was wanted, and the natives had no defence against them. In Africa, when slaves were captured or bought, they were branded like animals. Native peoples were used as slaves, and thousands died because of bad working conditions and harsh treatment. There were always plenty to replace them. Yet many more were killed by coming into contact with new diseases which the Europeans brought with them. Illnesses such as measles, smallpox, and chickenpox were often fatal because the natives had no immunity against them, because those diseases did not exist in their countries. Why was the empire important to trade? Britain, as an island, had been a seafaring, trading nation for many centuries. Importing raw materials, such as cotton, encouraged the development of industry. The more industry grew, the more raw materials were needed. By colonizing territories which had these materials, Britain established a steady supply of resources which could be manufactured in the new factories. It then sold many of the goods to the people living in the colonies. The colonies were therefore partly responsible for Britain's industrial success. With the growing empire, Britain's trade grew. The graph here shows how Britain's trade expanded from the year 1700 to the year 1900. Empire and the textile industry. The textile industry was one of the first in Britain to change and grow rapidly in the 18th century. This was due to the slave trade and the colonies Britain held in the West Indies. The West Indies had all the right conditions for growing cotton, and the thousands of African slaves transported onto the cotton plantations meant that it could be grown and picked very cheaply. Large quantities of raw cotton could now be shipped to England, where it could be spun and woven into cloth. With the invention of new textile machinery, greater quantities of raw cotton were needed. By the mid-19th century, cotton cloth and thread were being produced on a huge scale. The graph here shows how, over 100 years, the amount of raw cotton imported and cotton goods exported increased. It wasn't just in the field of textile manufacture where advancements in technology transformed trade and manufacturing. The effects of steam power on the empire and trade. The inhumane slave trade was officially abolished by Britain in 1807. Until that time, slaves and goods were transported on sailing ships. In the 19th century, however, new steam ships could transport cargoes of much greater weight and quantity much quicker. Steamships effectively brought the colonies closer to Britain and speeded up trade within the empire. The growth of the British Empire fueled the growth of industry back in Britain. This, in turn, generated great wealth and, in turn, enabled the further expansion of the British Empire. The growth of industry at this time is known as the Industrial Revolution. And we can see that the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire are closely linked.